So welcome everyone. I'm Beth Morrison from the NASW. I'm the regional coordinator for the Northeast region, and we are sponsoring this event for continuing education credits. And thank you for Closed Access TV for filming tonight so that the program will be available to more members of the community. So we are joined tonight to have a book discussion about the East Side of Addiction. Dr. DiReda earned a dual PhD in sociology and social work from Boston University and a master's degree in social work from the University of Connecticut. He is a licensed independent clinical social worker with over 33 years of direct clinical experience and consulting in the field of addictions. He has served as an advocate, treatment provider, researcher, and educator, working with individuals and families, hospitals, corrections facilities, and treatment programs, and private organizations on addiction. Dr. DiReda is an assistant professor in the School of Professional Studies at Anna Maria College in Paxton, Massachusetts, and he has published books and articles on addiction, speaks publicly on the topic, and has presented at local and international professional conferences. And we're waiting for your co-presenter,
Jack Maroney. I can do his bio if you want. Jack is.
He will be here shortly. Hopefully.
Did he send you anything, or?
I haven't.
I mean, I get embarrassed when people read these things. You know, it's like.
But thank you so much for coming all this way to present to us. I know that you did a previous program in Worcester, and it was a big success. And so they told me you were willing to take it on the road. So we
Absolutely.
We
Absolutely.
joined the Chelmsford Public Library and brought it to Chelmsford. So thanks for coming.
My pleasure. Thank you. And I haven't done anything yet. That's awesome. Show up and people clap when you haven't done anything. So Jack should be joining us. But, you know, Jack's bio is, you know, he comes from the same neighborhood I do. We grew up together. We've been friends, the three of us, for over 50 years until we lost Hank 2 years ago. And so, you know, since getting sober, because prior to getting sober, I had no Dr. DiReda, I had no education, I had a high school diploma, I had nowhere to live, I had no car, no girlfriend, no money. What am I missing? No job, no prospects. I was flattened out. 20 years of addiction had beaten me down and nearly killed me. Tried twice. That I was revived by paramedics in you know, on the sidewalk and in the hospital from overdosing. And so since then is when really the journey, this part of the journey started, the recovery part of the journey. And that's where most of the things that Beth read happened. And so prior to that, I was like any other person who was addicted or struggling with substance use disorder that you may see or know of. Nothing special. I was a sort of run-of-the-mill, I guess, if you will. One of the things I think that probably helped me was my family hadn't totally walked away yet, but they were close. They were on the edge. And what they said is, you know, because they had offered me help time and time again. And I kept saying, oh, no, I'm fine. Everything is great. When my world was in shatters. They knew it. Everyone around me knew it. The only one that didn't know it was me. And so once I couldn't go any further, which is really how the story, this part of the story started, as I ended up in treatment. And that was 33, almost April 1st will be 34 years ago that I haven't used any alcohol or drugs or tobacco or felt the need to in a long time. And so, you know, since that time, Jack, who, again, we've been friends for a long time, Jack had come back. We grew up together, the long and the short. We grew up together in the same community, the same neighborhood that you read about in that book. You know, struggled with all of the struggles that we engaged in or that we experienced, and oftentimes we're in different places. You know, I lived in Florida, I lived in Las Vegas. Jack lived in New York. Jack lived, you know, all over. Hank was all around, and our paths would cross all the time because we were in, you know, a lot of the stuff that we did was you know, drug trafficking or illegal drug sales and things like that. And so we were in different parts of the country. And then finally, when the bottom fell out for all of us, I guess, we ended up back in Central Mass and reconnected. And that's really where this leg of the journey began. is, you know, I was lost, they were lost, we didn't trust anybody, we didn't believe anybody that, you know, help was available or help or recovery was possible. And so when I ran into them and reconnected with them, at least I knew that I could trust them with my life. I just talked about, you know, sort of how we came out of the same neighborhood, same community, grew up together, and then ended up in different places doing different things, and then reconnected, and that's where the recovery journey really started. And so it's not that that's the only part of the story that's important, because I think where we come from really is equally as important, and may even shed light on how we ended up in the situations that we ended up in. It wasn't random, it wasn't coincidence that we ended up living the lives that we did. You know, so until you can sort of understand where we come from, then I think, you know, it's hard to grasp that part. But you know, that's what we usually start to talk about, is where we come from, our community. And so
But before that, I'd like to know who's here. So are mostly all of you social workers?
pretty much, I think. Although I
So
don't,
this is
I
your
don't think
first
we've
book
met.
of the month club, and we're it.
Really?
Hopefully it
Oh, how
doesn't
exciting.
work that way all the time. So thank you for your sacrifice. And I'm sure we all know that this is tough work that we do. So I'm not sure if Jim already went through his LICSW and
Yeah, Beth did
doctoral
that
stuff
when we started.
and all of that. I'm a licensed alcohol and drug counselor, a master's of healthcare administration, long-term treatment provider. I've started a couple of treatment facilities. I actually have a small little outpatient clinic in Woburn. That's where I came from, called Woburn Wellness. And both Jim and I and Hank, who's not here, and actually I should have brought his picture like I usually do, have a passion for helping others. And I think that's part of why we were able to kind of write the book and stuff like that, because we really care about what we do and helping others. And I think that's a big part of our recovery. And I think really, honestly, I think it's the helping others that has enabled me, I'll speak for myself, to actually be sitting here in front of you, despite the fact that I still get lost. But so, yeah.
Yeah, and I think, you know, the story where it usually starts for us is, you know, growing up in the community we did, which was, you know, let me do this way so I can see what we're doing here. Okay, so there's the three of us. And again, we've known each other, we've been friends for a long, long time, over 50 years. And so we came out of the same neighborhood, which is a very small neighborhood in Central Mass in Worcester, predominantly Italian, you know, middle class, I guess. And, you know, I think what I had mentioned earlier about understanding how we got here, you have to understand that. We grew up in a place and in a time that we were surrounded by people that were living a lifestyle that seemed appealing to us. And, you know, I come out of a family system where, you know, alcoholism, alcohol abuse, alcohol use was rampant, and illegal lifestyle was sort of the norm. And so those were the things, and not just the family that I come from, but our neighborhood, you know, that was sort of what made up a lot of the neighborhood. Not all of it. There were people that went to work, took care of their families, held down, you know, regular jobs, did normal life things. But the people that we looked up to were the ones that were doing the illegal behavior and things like that. And a lot of alcohol and fast living was involved. And we kind of aspired to those folks.
No, keep going. There's nothing in the background, though.
Oh, okay.
That's important.
Yeah. So those are the folks that we sort of looked up to and aspired to be like. You know, my dad was alcoholic. My dad was also a bookmaker, an illegal bookmaker who, you know, was in the numbers trade. And so there was a lot of fast money. There was a lot of, you know, behavior that was glitzy and appealing. And so that's what I was drawn to that. Before I ever drank or before I ever picked up a drug, I was drawn to that lifestyle. There was something in there that I think, you know, was you know, biochemical, that I got excited around that stuff, and it felt good. And so those are the people that I think, you know, myself and others in our neighborhood, in our group, aspire to be like, not the ones that were going to work and busting their butts, working 40 hours to bring home a decent pay and feed their family and take care of their family. You know, we wanted the fast lane sort of flashy stuff.
And Jim kind of basically said his story, but it's definitely not necessarily the same for all of us. And I think what we wrote about is we wrote about our neighborhood. So there were three central characters, myself, Jim, and Hank. I went to Catholic school all my life. Hanky went to St. John's, was a Catholic prep school. Jim went to North High Public School, which we believe in Worcester, as former Worcesterites, is a great school system. But we come from different backgrounds, but yet similar neighborhood. And I think the overriding thing that Jim was relating to or referring to is that we ended up really kind of teaching ourselves as peers what the social norm was at that time. And it's not that I had a lot of good direction from my parents and from the nuns and the priests and all of that stuff, honestly, more good direction than I needed, but it was different. So I think we were asked to kind of go over these objectives.
Yeah.
And what we would like this to do is make it somewhat interactive. I mean, your social workers, you're used to asking questions. Please do. This is very informal, even though there's somewhat of a format that we're following. So if at any point in time you want something clarified, you want to ask a question because we totally glossed over it, and I'm still lost and not figuring out where I am, please don't be afraid to kind of ask or even direct our conversation, because honestly, we're here for you. I would like to say, well, I will say it a little bit later on. So here's our risk factors, and these are the four main topics we're going to go through. And hopefully, as we go through each of these, you'll have questions for us, and we can have a conversation. Because honestly, I don't know about any of you, but I don't have any answers. I would like to say I had the formula for success, but if I did, I'd be in a yacht in the Caribbean sailing into the sunset and not here weathering this soon-to-be nor'easter. But the risk factors for developing the disease of addiction, the feelings from which alcohol, drugs provide relief, the various forms denial takes in keeping a person addicted, and why some people become addicted and others do not. And I think, you know, as you've probably seen this slide, this for me is where it all starts. I believe, I think I can speak for Jim in this, is drugs is just like a symptom of all this stuff that is underlying. Any thoughts about the slide or about any of the stuff that is up there right now? What's your own experience?
Are people familiar with the ACE study? Okay. So for me, at the time when all of these things were going on for me, I had no idea, no knowledge of this. But looking now in hindsight at it, for me, it just stacks up and helps explain. I didn't end up the way I did. I don't think any of us do by coincidence. There were a series of events. You know, I was looking for something. There's a great book called In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts by Gabor Mate. I was hungry. I was looking for something. I don't know exactly what. I'm trying to figure that out now in my old age. And the drugs kind of helped that and took care of that and made it okay. I didn't have to think about it. I didn't have to worry about it. Not until I stopped using the drugs and started to really look inside or to, you know, evaluate how the hell did I become a train wreck, did I start to realize that, you know, all of these things were happening. I just wasn't aware of them, and nobody was telling me or helping me with them or talking about those things.
So I think there's a couple of things that, you know, really stand out to me in some of the work that I do. And one of them is there is plenty of research out there, and some of it actually says that 75% of adults report a lifetime traumatic experience. And then pointing to there's a long-standing study, I think it's been going on for 30 years. It was called the Minnesota Longitudinal Study. And in that study, they found that trauma emerged as the most important predictor of adult functioning. So when you look at this stuff, and then you combine it with trauma or attachment, which I would say that, again, in my experience, probably 99% of the people that I've interviewed have that, one way or another. And so there's what we see as a lot of the underlying stuff that needs to be addressed. Unfortunately, and this is my own personal opinion, and in addiction treatment, we don't do a good job addressing this because our primary modality is group. And it's really hard to address that in a group setting. Now, we do that for a number of reasons. Being a treatment provider, the first one is it makes financial sense. But I think this is where we miss the mark, and I think this is where the funders miss the mark in being able to provide what could be a better road to recovery, to use that phrase, in many instances. Have you kind of found anything different or anything along your work, in your work?
What populations do you work with, or what settings do you work in? That might help. Do you see this population, or is it just a personal interest in the topic that brought you here, or is it part of your work?
I work in a high school.
Okay.
So it's there.
It's there.
Yeah.
Yeah. What about others?
I work with mothers in recovery and children at a residential home.
Okay.
So we do a lot of groups, but what you're saying is the trauma that they're not able to heal and deal with.
Right.
The time to deal with that I think is really lacking.
Yeah. What about other folks? Thank you.
Integrated healthcare. So I work with adults who have alcoholism as an issue,
Okay.
you know, duly diagnosed medical issues, et cetera.
Okay. So you see a fair share of it.
A lot of, cognitively
Mhm.
delayed and all of it.
Yeah. Thank you. Anyone else?
I have a psychology background and a chemistry background, so
Okay.
I'm curious about, the internal workings about, say, addiction, what goes on in the brain, and also have a child who wandered off into drug addiction, and he's a plus now, so it's part of it.
Okay.
Retired.
Okay. Well, thank you. Anybody
So
else?
we're definitely kindred spirits. I was a chemical engineer.
I would just say, private practice right now, but just so many people have trauma in their lives. And just paying attention to what implications that has through the lifespan. I do a lot of geriatric work too. It's very interesting to see where somebody is
Mhm.
years after the kinds of experiences they had to cope with and deal with, especially with things not being named back
Yeah.
then.
Right,
addictions,
yeah.
The different types of abuses and everything. People survived so much on their own without being able to share it with others.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I think when you were speaking, what occurred to me is, people suffering or experiencing those issues, but not really even being aware that that's what it is. So it's hard to name something and treat something, so we focus or we zoom in on the substance use disorder stuff, and maybe some of us, it sounds like, understand that there's usually a underlying trauma or some sort of, co-occurring disorder or whatever, but oftentimes they don't know it. And they think, and I'll speak, firsthand for me, when I first went into treatment, I thought all I needed to do was stop using drugs. And I didn't even want to stop drinking. I just thought, the drugs were my problem. I just need to stop that. And everything else in life will fall into place and be okay. I had no idea about this stuff. I had no idea because I had never looked at who I was and how I might have ended up the train wreck that I became, I just blamed it all on the drugs and the alcohol, which was very narrow or short-sighted, and never really understood that, you know, if I went through those, I would probably score a 9 out of 10, maybe 10 out of 10 from my life. And so again, you know, I think, what's the number, Jack, at the scoring number? If you scored like yes on 3 of these or whatever?
Well, an ACE score of 6 is a 4,600% increase of being an IV drug.
So if I had a 10 out of 10, I think it's a slam dunk that, you know, that's where my train was heading. I just didn't know it. I wasn't aware of it. That's why when you said that, I thought, yeah, there's that lack of awareness that oftentimes people come with, because, yeah, so many, and we've, you know, I've been doing this since I got sober, which is over 33 years. Jack has been doing it since he got sober, this work. And so, you know, you start to look at it and learn and realize, or at least for me, realize like, oh, okay, well, it's starting to make a little more sense now how this all happened. But at the time, I thought, you know, I just had bad luck, or, you know, whatever, or I was, you know, I don't know, got in with the wrong group or whatever, and it just wasn't the case. This was the case, but I didn't have any awareness about that.
So, despite the fact that I got lost and couldn't find Chelmsford, the book found its way to Albania. So we were recently published, actually this week, in Albanian. Now, part of that is because Albania, this tiny little country, actually has the largest per capita drug problem in the entire world. And some of that is due to the previous slide. Economically, Albania is considered a developing country. And I think, you know, as you look around the world and you kind of look at the countries that truly still are having problems, it's a lot of these emerging kind of economies where people relatively don't have a lot of opportunity, where you find an awful lot of drug use. And that's in a country where they don't have money to buy drugs, but yet every single hectare, which is land in Albania, is being used to either grow pot, grow poppy, or grow coca leaves. But to talk about a little bit about this, how many of you have heard about Rat Park? Okay, that was part of your homework assignment, right? So that was good. So Rat Park was a social experiment by Bruce Alexander that really kind of questioned the finding about drugs being so addictive versus the environment. So that's what the whole thing was all about. And, you know, the view of Bruce Alexander and his researchers is that addiction in today's world, the flood of addiction is occurring because of our hyper-individualistic, hyper-competitive, frantic, crisis-ridden society, which makes most people feel socially and culturally isolated. And that's what they found about Rat Park, is that once they took the rats out of Skinner boxes, which was, they were isolated, basically in jail. And of course, if you're in jail, wouldn't you choose morphine over doing time? That once they took them out of that and put them in an environment where they could play and interact with each other, that they didn't choose to go for the morphine. And for those that were actually addicted to the morphine, they actually stopped using. So that the social aspects of life you know, can be more important than drug use itself. Now, I have my own theories about the internet and all of that stuff and today's technology that might be contributing to some of that, because if there's ever been a greater dopamine vehicle in the world than it is, who has a cell phone? Oh, I don't.
I just so happen to have one.
It's this thing. Every time we search, which is an appropriate word for what we do, really triggers, talking about our systems, our reward system, and it triggers dopamine. So the dopamine is actually triggered because of anticipation and not actual use. So there's a real understanding as to why people, despite the negative consequence, continue to use, because it's the reward anticipation, not the actual use, that triggers the behavior.
Same as gambling.
Yeah. Yeah, same exact thing as gambling. Yeah, because what happens in gambling most of the time?
Anticipation.
Yeah, oh, you lose, right? So it's not very fun once you're gambling. And honestly, as a recovering drug addict, half of the time you use it ended up being disappointment. It didn't get you where you thought it was going to go, but it was the anticipation of that made it continue.
You know what's funny, and you just saying that, is it made me think, and I didn't think of this prior to, is just the ping that lets you know that there's somebody trying to reach you. You know what I mean? That sort of stimulates that process that all of a sudden I'm in. You know, now I'm preoccupied with the anticipation of who that might be. You know, is it that publisher clearinghouse calling to tell me that I've won that $500,000 for life or whatever? Yeah, so talk about Pavlovian, my God.
Remember early on when you got the ding in the computer that said, "You've got mail"? I mean, these phones were once free, right? Now they're like $1,200.
Yeah,
Talk
right.
about drug dealing.
Yeah. Do you think it would help? And again, you know, we kind of go everywhere, and that's our style, I guess. These things help us to somewhat stay on track and focused. But you know, would it be helpful to sort of talk a little bit about how we ended up at that juncture where chapter 2 began, or not in the book, but the chapter of our life, the recovery chapter of our lives? Would that be helpful for people at all? Okay. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
We can, but before we start that,
Okay.
because I think that's going to come up.
Oh, okay.
That's a quote by Gabor Mate, In the Realm of the Hungry Ghost. It's Jim loves the book. I love the book. I think he's a doc that does a lot of work in Vancouver in the East End, and I believe he probably hits the nail on the head better than anybody with that simple quote. Addiction is neither a choice nor a disease, but originates in a human being's desperate attempt to solve a problem. The problem of emotional pain, of overwhelming stress, of lost connection, of lost control, of a deep discomfort within the self. And Dr. Mate was actually a baby born post
During the Nazi takeover, right?
right, but post-concentration camp. His mom actually gave him away to his aunt to kind of save him from that. So one of his favorite quotes is that every Jewish baby in Europe was crying during that time. So they were all born depressed. And he himself has a self-admitted addiction to CDs and classical music, where he spends an inordinate amount of time in the music store and will buy and buy and buy classical music, despite the fact he'll never listen to all the stuff he bought. So it's, yes.
There's almost a dichotomy, because in addiction, someone becomes so self-centered, so self-inclusive, that what you're saying is socialization is inevitable.
Right. Right. And it is, and a lot of it is contradictory. And I think therein lies the kind of craziness, and makes it hard to understand why. And I think, you know, speaking for myself, you know, I never understood why. I mean, here I was a Catholic school kid that in the 5th to 6th grade would die for Christ. You know, I wanted to be a martyr. And how did that, you know, go and end up that way? I don't know.
But it is an illness that sort of fosters sort of isolation, disconnection. You disconnect from people around you, and slowly, and sometimes not so slowly, push them out of your life. You sever connection with self, and you end up lost. And the only thing that feels good is some artificial substance that you put in your body that anesthetizes or quells all of that distress or discomfort. And so it's easy to become reliant or dependent on that because it works. That's the downside of it. The only thing is it continues, I think, as you were alluding to, further and further, deeper and deeper isolation. You end up in this dark, alone, painful, miserable place that the only thing that even sounds appealing is something to anesthetize that and make it stop. And so here we are, and it goes on and deeper and deeper and deeper. And then recovery is a process of how do we reconnect? How did we reconnect with us, the three of us? How do you reconnect with family, others around you? How do you reconnect with self? And that's not easy, when you've been sort of disconnected for me, it was 20-odd years. I think even prior to, I used to think, we were chit-chatting before we started, I used to think that the drugs and the alcohol were responsible for all the pain and misery in my life. And then in recovery, if you're not familiar with it, one of the steps of recovery is to go inward and take your own inventory and take a look at your life. And what I learned is, again, dovetails with the ACE study, what I learned is I was doing all those things before I ever put drugs and booze in my body. I was lying, I was avoiding, I was running from reality. I was doing all kinds of things that I used to think the drugs made me do. But when you tease it apart, when I teased it apart, I realized I was doing those things before the drugs, which kind of circles us back to the ACE study, is I was, again, unhappy or distressed or whatever because of the conditions of my life and, circumstances. And once I put alcohol or drugs in my system and I found that it quieted my nervous system down, I thought, this is it. This is the cure. This is it. This is all I need. And David Sheff, there's a great movie out called Beautiful Boy, based on a book that David Sheff wrote about his son Nick's addiction. And in there he says, what I learned, because he knew nothing about addiction until he went through this journey with his son. He said, one of the things that I learned is drugs were not the problem for my son. They were the answer. And bang, that made sense to me. It clicked. For me, that was the answer. That solved everything. And so it became best friend, lover, anything important in my life was that. And so you do get disconnected from self, from reality, from others. And it's a scary, alone, horribly miserable place, dark, painful place to be. And it just kind of, I think, fuels the need for more drugs and booze in order to make the pain stop. And then, when it does, or when you do stop using the substances, then you're left with the mess. Now what do you do? Because once the mess starts to rear its head again, because it's no longer knocked out by the booze and the dope, now you got some hard choices to make. Do I knock it out again, or do I find another way to deal? And that's the recovery piece.
So this slide is to provide proof to usually when we do something in front of kids that we were young once, even though it was a long time ago. And so I don't know if you can pick out the people in those slides, but that was Jim as a teenager. Well, actually, how old were you then, Jim? Maybe?
18.
18?
Yeah.
And that picture below is photoshopped. I swear those stuffed animals weren't mine. But that was me in my not so glorious days. I don't know who took that picture. They would have probably Narcaned me if Narcan was available back then, but it wasn't even heard of back then, that's for sure. And I think, one of the things that this slide talks about, and again, it talks about, some risk factors, but most of the stuff in our mind, in our brain, depending upon where your beliefs lie in neuroscience, is laid down from an early age. And so there are many people that will say that we live through our past, that all our decisions are colored with our past experiences. And these neural pathways, the more often they've been triggered, the more likely they are to be the default response in our dealing with the present moment. But key environmental factors, and there's the latest in neuroscience talks a lot about what causes addiction. And there's a new kind of idea that it's a mix between genetics and environment, and that genes are not turned on because they're simply genes. Genes are turned on by outside factors. And so that's what they now call epigenetics, and that environment has a big role on that. And then one of the things that I always found of real interest is in attachment work, there's the adult attachment narrative. And that is proven to be a 75% predictor of what type of attachment the child will have, depending upon the adult narrative. And so if you talk about genetics, what easily gets lost is that it's not necessarily genetics, but it can be the early life nurturing kind of opportunities or lack thereof that can set the stage for many of these kind of neural pathways to be either germinated or not as you progress through life, depending upon the environment that you're in. And I think there's some research that's out there that suggests that extensive peer contact and the loss of adult attachment leads to a heightened propensity for addiction. So there's a lot of research out there that says that some of the things that happen in our modern day society that were happening a lot more in the past are really contributing to what this current epidemic is.
And there's a lot of good stuff on brain chemistry out there, some old, some new. I just had the pleasure of sitting in on, there's a guy he's an MD named Kevin McCauley, who has a great video out called Pleasure Unwoven that speaks to the brain chemistry, and it's really powerful. You know, there's a local woman, Ruth Potee, I think is how you say her name, out in Western Mass. She's another MD that does a lot of work on brain chemistry. Dr. Volkov from NIDA, I think is where she is. You know, there's a lot of stuff out there to help you to understand that, or to help me understand it better.
And I think a really good one, actually, for therapists is Daniel Siegel. So Daniel Siegel has written A Mindful Therapist. He's written The Neurobiology of We. He's written and Daniel Siegel is like a Harvard psychiatrist, but I think if you listen or read any of his stuff, it really will resonate, because he's one of those people that kind of looks at the latest in science and has a really open mind on, you know, what may be the latest stuff that works a little bit better than some of the stuff that we haven't done before. Actually, his story is pretty interesting. He dropped out of medical school because back then when he was going to medical school, they thought it wasn't a good idea to talk to your patients and get involved with who they are. And so he has a therapist mind because he believes that that's where true healing takes place, not necessarily in reading something out of a textbook.
I think before you switch that, I just want to comment on, you know, the stark contrast between then and now, because I noticed the word resilience or resiliency up there, and you know, not until I look back, I think we were talking earlier about, you know, when I look back or read some of the book or excerpts or talk about it, you know, it's almost like a different world or a different person or a different experience sitting here now, you know what I mean? Which is what those slides on the right represent, is stuff that we do in our professional lives now, which, you know, I mean, you don't have to search far and wide to put together what we were like back then. You know, it's just such a contrast. But that's the whole recovery, I think, you know, that opens up the doors to all of those things. And so, you know, a lot of times when people would, you know, talk about that book, one of the things they say, and it's really one of the reasons we wrote it, is to offer people some hope. You know, I mean, look at me up in that corner. Come on. You know what I mean? I was pretty bad off, and I thought at that point, I thought I had it all together. I thought I was something special, you know. And so what I like to think is if we can change our lives and recover from this sickness with a lot of help, then other people can too. And people need to see that, and people need to hear that, is that you can come from this to this, it just takes a lot of damn work, but it is doable. And that's the message of hope in there, which is really why one of the main reasons that we wrote the book was to offer some hope, what we've learned, education or information-wise, but really to put our faces out there and say, this is where we came from, and this is where we are. It's hard, and there's never a day off from it, but it's well worth it, and you too can do it. And that message, I think, resonates in that book, or at least the feedback that we get is that message resonates in that book pretty clearly. So I didn't want to jump off this slide before mentioning that.
Any questions about, or thoughts, other thoughts about risk factors that you may see in your own work, or how maybe to begin to identify risk factors early on? There are some kind of high risk kind of signposts for kids, especially in grammar school and or high school, that may help kind of divert someone from what is, from what is not a very happy ending. And I think one of the things that both Jim and I, being treatment providers, have really come to realize that prevention is really where a lot more of our efforts need to go. It's such an intractable disease once someone is in the middle of it. And turning that life around is really difficult. But preventing it from being there is probably where we will get much more value for our time and energy and money spent. And for whatever reason, I'm not sure, present company excluded, why school systems and the current education system is so reticent to embrace that. We have this information that's out there about, about the early informative years is such a predictor of what's going to happen as an adult. And yet, the resources that we put in are what? An MCAS score. We've taken away arts, we've taken away theater, we've taken away after-school activities. We encourage competition and actually, to some extent, isolation, except for the kind of standard packaged team sports. But other than that, without drama and arts and theater, we've taken away the ability, and we don't celebrate it. There's Ken Robinson, I believe is his name, is an educator from England. And if you ever want to laugh and learn something for 20 minutes, he does this unbelievable TED Talk about how we should celebrate differences and how we don't. We want everybody to fit into this little box that resembles that you need to be a math major or a computer science. But if you're not that, you don't count. And that's another bad message that we're sending to our kids that are talented as dancers, musicians, artists, or what have you. They just don't fit into that mathematical model. And I think, honestly, listen, he's so funny that you think he's a comedian, but everything that he says is right on, at least from this simple person's point of view.
When you're talking about risk factors, just throwing this out there, and probably nobody really has an answer. Like I said, I work in residential with women and children, right? So we know obviously these children have a higher risk factor already because one, they're living in a residential home with moms who are addicted and in recovery. They've been taken away from their families. They've been put in foster care systems. What is it that we can do to help minimize their risk while they're in our care for 9 months? What are some of the ideas? Because obviously the funding isn't there to help them. The schools aren't helping, like you said, by taking things away. How can we help them in our short time to minimize their risks when they've already been so damaged, if you will, before they get to us? Am I making any sense?
Yes, no,
Absolutely.
All the sense, and it's very tough with a developing young child. So, I always go back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I always, with everything, because I am a big wellness person. I love the holistic stuff. I love yoga. I love meditation. I love all of that. But if someone doesn't know where they're going to sleep, it's awfully hard to get involved in a yoga class. And it is, but it's not impossible. But if we can satisfy the basic needs, that's definitely the start. And what I see in terms of attachment and all of that is that if we can be consistent in what our behaviors are, then I think those young kids you can help them develop a better sense of security. Because it's not the kids with secure attachment that are showing up in our treatment facilities. It's the ones that are avoidant, anxious, and all of that. And how do you help do that is through consistency. Because if you're consistent, you actually know what to expect, and the anxiety can go down. But believe me, I go back to the opening statement. If I knew, I'd be on a yacht in the Caribbean, not here. Yeah.
But I think we do know some stuff, and I don't mean just Jack and I think we as humans know, and when we talk about it, we realize, connection is really important, especially when they come from a place where, that's been damaged. Education and connection are really important, and consistency of being able to help, it could be being in your program with, say that again? Yeah, it may be that that's their first experience or their first experience in a long time with feeling a connection to anybody. Now, obviously, it's not going to last forever. They're going to move on from the environment that they're in, but they've had that experience of what it feels like to truly connect with another human being. And the educational piece, again, about the risk factors, about the ACE information, about genetics, about all those things, obviously age appropriate, but those are the things I think that will help us to change this. As Jack said earlier, most addicts that we've worked with and treated in our lives, in our professional lives, by the time they get to us, have probably 10 plus years in as addicted. And so it's hard to turn that around. It's possible, obviously, we're sitting here, but it's much, much harder. It's so much, I think, more I don't want to say easy because none of this is easy, effective maybe at the younger ages to do the things we're talking about. And I think we know it. It's just, as Jack said, it's the reticence. It's the, we don't want it in here. We don't have that problem here. Someone mentioned to me yesterday about those public school system and the audacity of them to think that they don't have a problem with these things we're talking about in their school system with their population. Like, where's your head? You know what I mean? Like, how can you not see this? And yet, it's more. I mean, we know it's more than that. We know people see it. It's politics, it's denial, it's all of that stuff that we talk about. But back to, to come back to your question without continuing to sort of beat the drum, is I think those are the chances we have. And they're not glitzy, they're not sexy, they're not new treatment interventions that can sell, or they're not a new pill or medication that we can sell and sensationalize. It's basic, how do you treat me? And can I connect to that and feel whatever comes with that and file that? And start to learn, wow, there are people that don't scream and hit each other. There are people that talk to one another. There are people that are calm and that actually are accessible, and those are the things that I think, and I think we sing from the same song sheet. We've been doing this long enough and we've known each other long enough, about the approach and what we believe works. And so I think I can speak for both of us in saying those are the things, and especially prevention. That analogy of when I went to social work school, the first thing I learned was, that old story about the bodies coming down in the river and everybody pulling the bodies out of the river, and then, us two go running up and people want to know, where the hell are you going? And we say, we're going upstream. We're going to find out where the bodies are coming from. So we have to go upstream. We have to figure out how this is happening. Otherwise, we're going to continue to pull bodies out of the river. And we've been doing that a long time. I've been doing it for over 30 years. I'm tired. I'm tired of losing people, of watching people suffer.
Yes.
I guess on a similar note, and recognizing that hindsight is 20/20, and also things are very different today than they were, 45 or 50 years ago. What do you think, people could have done to help you guys kind of back in that time when you were in middle school or high school that would have maybe made a difference?
It's a great question.
Changed the path of things?
Yeah, well, hindsight is wonderful, but I don't have a great answer, partly because people did try. You know, people did try to say you're heading down the wrong path, you know, things like that are pretty common. And of course, because of my denial or because of my sickness or my budding sickness, I couldn't hear it. It didn't register. So I'm not sure. I guess they could have, you know, been more aggressive about, you know, how they dealt with me or whatever, but that didn't happen. You know, in theory, I guess, you know, treatment or some sort of intervention might have helped, but that's a long shot. I don't know. At 13, 14, 15 years old, I was just getting up ahead of steam. There was no stopping for me, I don't think.
And I think back then, not to date myself, back then, people just didn't know what they didn't know. I mean, I would come home, I would have a bag of marijuana, I'd say, Ma, don't leave that parsley alone, and she wouldn't know the difference. You know, she really wouldn't. And this is early on. I mean, actually, I was really late onset. Like I said, I went to Catholic school. I drank when I was younger. My first experiment with drugs was in college. I went to the University of Massachusetts. Not that that was the reason, but I was an addict waiting to happen. It was the right time. I think we've realized that some of the things that we needed to do, we are doing, and that's educate. That really is educate. But on top of just the education, it's the acceptance, and once you receive that, to actually do something with it. The sad news is that there are a ton of educators in the school system that know, but drug addicts are not the only ones in denial. They really are not the only ones in denial. And I'm going to be quiet, but one of the things, to answer your question before that, I love, and why I love Daniel Siegel so much, is my favorite line from anything I've ever read is the best way to care for people is to care about them. And I really think that's what it is. It takes a village. It takes all of us together to be able to turn a life around. And we all have to care. And I think if we're the only one in the room that's caring and everybody else is tugging the other way, you're just ripping somebody apart. And that, I think, it really speaks to what happens is that we all need to get on the same page, and we're not. We've been involved in bringing docs together where half of them think it's a medical problem and the other one thinks it's a moral issue. I mean, this is still happening. It was happening a lot more 10 years ago, but it's still happening today. And so we're not all on the same page. We don't have the village moving in the same direction, and it does take that. Yes.
The one thing that we see at our level in the residential with the women and the children is trust is huge.
Right.
That we need to get them,
Right.
it can sometimes take 6 months
Right.
for them to realize that we're not the enemy, that we're actually trying to help them. And until they're ready to see that, sometimes we don't see a change in said clients for
Right.
that length of time.
Right.
You know, we just had a graduation the other day, which was amazing, because when this client walked in the door, I don't have a problem, I'm not here for any reason, I'm just here to get my child back. The transformation that she made in 9 months was huge. You know, and it was good for the newer clients to see that. You know, and, you know, we make a big deal about change, because that's what we want from them, but they need to want it as well.
Yeah, no, I hear that, and
We don't have that regard, that positive regard for them, and show them that compassion.
Yeah.
How are we modeling the behavior that we want them to follow
right?
to learn?
Yeah.
So trust, I wish we could learn more about having understanding of trust with them, so that they can trust us,
Right.
that we're doing what's best for them.
Yeah, and I think when you said what you said, it just made me think. You opened up by saying something about them seeing it, and what came to mind was, you know, I think it comes from like The Little Prince or something about, you know, the most valuable things in life you don't see with your eyes. Is they're going to have to feel it, I think, with a lot of this stuff. You know what I mean? Compassion isn't, I don't think, something you can really see, but you can feel it and trust and you know, it's hard. This is hard. What you folks do, what we do is hard work. And there is no easy answer. Oh, just here, here's the prescription, do this or take this, or, say some magic words and it'll all change. That's Walt Disney stuff. It doesn't work that way. It's rolling up your sleeves, and it's all, I'm surprised that I'm going to say this, but I'll say it anyway, is it's all relational. It's all about our relationships with those people that we interact with or that we treat or that we come in contact with. It's all about relationships and how they feel, throughout or based on that interaction we have with them. And that's where the trust, that's where the connection, that's where all those things, I think, happen or will happen, and those you can't see. You have to feel them. And that's hard to, sell, especially to people that you're asking for money. They want to see outcomes, they want to see MAT scores or what's the ones they use in the school system?
MCAS.
The MCAS scores. They want to see tangible score. You can't say, well, we formed a connection and it felt good. It doesn't sell. So it's hard stuff. I have a question, though, for you folks. Would that be okay? Could I ask you a question? Why did you choose that book? Because this is a book club. Somebody said, hey, let's read East Side. Who did that and why? Local, okay. What else? Anything else?
I just got the newsletter that said it was happening, and I was like, oh, this looks interesting.
It wasn't a group decision of,
Oh, so you don't say, here's the book we're reading for the month, and
no, we just got this email from, the council.
oh, okay.
Yeah.
So Beth, how did this happen? Like, who chose that book and why?
So, it happened because the central NASW coordinator said, hey, I have this great, because they have an ongoing book club that they've been
Right.
doing for a long time that's very successful.
Yeah, we did that.
So
We did this with them.
And she called me and she's like, I think this would be a great program to take on the road, and the officers are willing to do it again. And I was like, okay, it's a very hot topic right now with
Yeah.
the
Right.
opioid
Yeah.
epidemic that we're dealing with, and Merrimack Valley is definitely struggling with the
Right.
opioid crisis with Lowell and Lawrence, and so it's kind of it's a topic that I thought people would find interesting,
Okay.
and so
Okay.
that's how.
Okay. Which is a little different. What I thought, you all get together, pick a book, read it, and then come and discuss it, and okay.
No, yeah, this is the first in the series of many books that you're going to be
Yeah,
reading,
so
right?
hopefully-
Yeah.
I think Susan might be willing to do our next book, so we're working on one for March.
Now, do you give CEUs for today?
Yep.
Yes.
All right, and that's a benefit, that way, and they're somewhat, almost free, right? So that definitely works in a big way also.
Okay.
Before we go further, what time are we ending?
We got an hour.
8:30.
We're ending at 8:30. Okay, so we have time.
Yeah.
So this is not a quiz, but in reading the book, did anything stick out that you would like to talk about so we don't miss that? What are some of the things that you said, oh wow, this is, wow, that didn't, any of that? Did anything in the book strike any of you as, boy, I should talk about that a little bit? So that means no one read it. No, I'm only kidding.
I remember, in the beginning, reading, the different stories and thinking, oh yeah, I can understand how you would start using like that because of, growing up this way and that way.
Yeah.
It's, you start using because of the way you grew up and stuff with the people that you were hanging out with. Because coming from a country myself, I had similar circumstances. And then I read the next part of the story and I'm like, oh, wait a minute, that's a little bit different, different childhood. They shouldn't really use, but I can see where they would grow up using and getting addicted. And I'm thinking to myself, well, it really doesn't matter how you grew up or who you hung out with, and that's the part I kept forgetting.
Right.
So it kind of brought me back to reality as to the people that I'm treating and the people that I'm working with, and even to myself.
Right.
I know why I grew up the way I did, but it doesn't matter the lifestyle, and that's kind of what it brought me back to.
Right.
Or the upbringing that you had, or the school that you went to, or the family, or the house that you lived in. It's the circumstances and the person themselves that gets you into addiction and what you perceive it, you know, as you said, the money flashing and what catches your eye and where you go. It's the free will that starts you on that wrong path, you know. So that it didn't really matter. That's the part that caught my interest in the very beginning. It's just the 3 different upbringings that still led to the same outcome.
And I think that's why we felt it was a book that was worth, because not only, again, it wasn't just us 3, it was several other of our friends that ended up in long-term, and they all had varying degrees or different childhoods.
Right.
And so there's no specific formula. And so one of the things that is really fundamental and crucial to say is that it's not about blaming anybody. It definitely isn't, and I think that's one of the reasons why we still don't talk about trauma, we still don't talk about attachment, we still don't talk about the ACE study as much as we can, because automatically, as a parent, you blame yourself, or you're blaming yourself as it is anyways, and so that kind of extra layer makes it that much more difficult. So it needs to be, the conversation needs to be definitely in a way that is not finger pointing, not condemning, not punitive or any of that stuff. It's just circumstances. You know, it's like the perfect storm out in, you know, it's just things come together, and that's what creates, you know, such a havoc.
I think to me what was really striking was kind of looking at the trajectory that all of your lives took, and, you know, even though you separated at various points in time, you know, you came back together and the trajectory was fairly similar. And that to me was really striking, because when you get to the end of the book and it's like, you know, where are we now? And it was sober 30 years, sober 31 years. So, and, you know, and so it gave this feel, you know, reading through the book, that you kind of needed each other to get into the addiction, but you also needed each other to get out of it. And that was kind of striking to me, and how it, you know, all of your lives took similar paths, even though they diverged at various points in time.
I think that made it easier for us, because we had that commonality, that we came back in, we were friends once, we were reunited again, wow, doesn't this feel good? Because what happens during the addictive cycle is those friendships go away. Nothing else matters but drugs. You know, so you leave your family, you leave your friends, and you end up falling in love with something that's ultimately going to destroy you. But once, if you're fortunate enough to stop, however, and then be able to reconnect. And that's why, Jimmy, it's about relationships. So having these familial relationships were easy to bond again. I think that's the toughest thing for someone that comes in and knows nobody. There's a lot of work. There's a lot of work involved in sticking in and making a friendship as an adult. We have all this stuff already that is kind of hindering you from being with another person, another adult. How do you do that? You know, we grew up as kids, and you made friends with kids, and you stayed friends. And that's the extra challenge. I think for us, that was eliminated a little bit. We had that kind of combination. I think that's one of the nice things about 12-Step, quite honestly, is it gives you a place to find people that are similar and will be open to developing a relationship. Not easy to find, not impossible, but not easy to find, but you may find it in a religious fellowship. You may find it in some other things where everybody's doing the same thing in common. But, you know, I mean, 12-Step is easy because, you know, it's in a book and you can find it and go and stuff like that.
But I think that's, you know, I know for myself, if Jack and Hank, and there's another good friend of ours in the book, we call him Kid Paz, but his name is Robbie. He was one of the first people I ran into when I sobered up, because I had gone to 12-Step meetings and didn't know anybody, and like Jack just said, you know, I didn't trust anybody, and I was 31 or 32 years old. You know, I didn't want to sort of try to make new friends, you know what I mean? And I was full of shame and remorse and guilt, and just felt like a puke, but didn't have any drugs to make that what we were talking about earlier, didn't have any drugs or chose not to take drugs or alcohol to sort of assuage that. And so I was kind of raw. And if somebody looked at me cross-eyed, that would have been enough for me to say, the hell with these people, I ain't staying around here. And out the door I would have gone. But I ran into Robbie, and I had known Robbie since we were kids. And then I ran into Hank, and I ran into Jack. And like Jack just said, it just made it so much easier because I did trust them, and I knew them, and they knew me. And so I didn't have to, hey, want to be my friend, and I'll tell you all about my life. We knew each other's lives. And so, for me, and I don't know if they felt the same, number one, I don't know if I would have been successful without them. I hung on for dear life, and that, I think, saved me. And I don't know if I would have stuck around. I really don't, because I was pretty damaged when it came to relationships. I didn't know how to have healthy relationships. I didn't know how to reach out and be friends. If I was high, I could do it. If I was high, I'd be your best friend without even knowing you. But without those, without that sort of courage or buffer or whatever it was, I was lost and very fragile. And so, yeah, it is about relationships, and having relationships with these guys, as long-standing as they were, even though they were pretty damaged. I mean, our relationships, not them individually, but we still kind of had the core. We still had the connection. Didn't have to form a new connection. We knew each other's lives. We knew what we had endured. We knew what we were about. And so that made it, I think you're right, I think it made it a lot easier for me. So, oh, yeah.
And so why do some people and others do not? So that's me and my brother. I think that's Jim and his brother.
Yeah.
And, my brother was a plumber. I was a rocket scientist. I'm the one who got drug addicted. My brother didn't. Go figure, same parents, same whatever. I was actually the chosen one because I was the first grandparent in first grandchild in my entire family, so everybody doted over me. But sometimes there is no formula that says this is what's going to happen. Although I will say, school, early aggressiveness, high sensation seeking. But I smoked cigarettes probably at 8 or 9 years old. Back then, that wasn't even that unusual. Everybody smoked cigarettes. So were there plenty of risk factors that if someone really took a step back, and you would think that the nuns would say, geez, here he is, class treasurer, smoking cigarettes and lying, stealing, whatever I was doing. Those were high-risk behaviors that, had you known, should have been addressed. And I think those are the things that if you discover those things, if kids are starting to screw up in school, there's probably a reason they're screwing up rather than lack of trying. It's not we always want to blame the person that's not doing well for not doing well. And I think one of the things that I see in our system, in our treatment system, is, we're full of blame. You didn't get it because you didn't try hard enough. Not too many of my clinicians say you didn't get it because I was a bad clinician, or I failed to recognize some of the stuff that was going on. I really have a hard time throwing people out of treatment when you should expect that behavior is not going to be good because they've never had an opportunity in the first place. Yeah. So someone needs to change, and someone needs to begin to love them because they may have never experienced it. And I think, there's a lot, and we're human, and it's tough being nice to someone that's not nice to you. It's really tough stuff. And again, I started out applauding you for doing the work. I continue to do that. I'm honored to be in a group of people that care. And that's why I love Daniel Siegel so much, because that's, to me, what the secret is.
It's interesting that you said that. Well, what's ironic is the similarities, because, that's me with my brother, who did not develop a substance use disorder or problem, didn't smoke, didn't drink or abuse alcohol. I had my first blackout at 12, and he went on and could have gone on further. He was killed in a car accident when I was like 15, but he was on a path to being groomed to go to law school and do the right thing or whatever, and I was sort of deviant, as you can imagine, and so the messages I got were, you know, you need to figure out how you're going to survive in life because college is not an option for you. You're not that smart, you know, all of that stuff, which I bought and thought, you know, well, okay, then I'll find some other way. And sad to say, the other way that I sort of found was you know, a path that was pretty destructive. But, you know, it's interesting that, you know, you said the same thing about your brother Patrick, who didn't develop, you know, didn't smoke. That, you know, it's kind of interesting to see those and look at it now because sometimes it just doesn't make any rhyme or reason. Why me and not him, you know, or why you and not your brother? It doesn't make sense sometimes. And we look for it to make sense. We like when things make sense. And oftentimes with this, they just don't. You know, there's so much to it that, you know, when we talk about this illness, we talk about it being an illness of mind, body, and spirit. And you can't just treat one aspect. You can't just treat the body and send someone to detox and expect all the rest of it is just going to fall into place and life is going to be great. You have to treat all the areas of a human being that are affected. Jack opened up saying something about he likes the holistic approach. I think that's the only approach that makes sense. If 3 areas of a human being are damaged, you can't just fix one or treat one and expect the other parts to be, you know, find their way. You have to address all 3 of those. And the way we talk about it is through some of those holistic approaches of meditation and yoga and exercise and relationships and things like that.
So one of my favorite headings in the little chapters that are between our stories in the book is this one. The chief cause of unhappiness is trading what you want most for what you want now. And I can look back at my life. Again, I went to school, chemical engineer, I could have had a great career. But what I wanted now was to sell pot. And there went chemical engineering. And so in time and time again, I look at my choices, and I could live by that saying. That could be the story of my life, that saying. But it's not the story of my life, because it did change.
It was a chapter in your life.
It was a chapter, right, it was a chapter. Any thoughts on any of this, about why people, I mean, there's twin studies out there, exact same DNA, everything, one is, one isn't. Even the exact same environment. So that's how complicated and complex this is. So, yes.
I would think that you would also be extremely successful even if you hadn't reunited with your friends from childhood. And I think that that's the beauty of the recovery process, is that people, you know, the 12-step program helps a zillion people. So you could have been in recovery out in California, you're living out in California, and still be as successful there as you are here, you know, not having reunited with your friends. You know, it would look different.
Thank you.
Because I fully believe in the recovery process, and I fully believe that people make it regardless of who it is. It's that higher power, and people get linked with people through that. And many people are howling successes without their friends from their childhood, you know,
Right.
which thank God, because just people get there in just so many different ways.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think for me, the tricky part was, you know, I agree with that piece. If I had stuck around, I was shaky and didn't know without having some familiar faces if I would have stuck around. And maybe I would have got it the next time or not, I don't know. But I didn't have to experience that. So I was and still am really thankful that these friends were there. Because again, I think that was huge in me being able to do what I've done. And yeah, maybe I could have done it elsewhere and at a different time, I don't know, or without them. Don't know, but at the moment, because I was so fragile, I could have spooked pretty easily and gone for the door, you know, again, if somebody just looked at me wrong. Because I was so, I don't know, it's almost like naked. You know what I mean? And like anything was like just too hard to tolerate because I had used alcohol and drugs to cope with life or to manage life for 20 odd years. And so now to be able to cope with life and manage life without that cushion or buffer or whatever you want to call it, layering, was really hard. You know, but I like your confidence. Thank you.
And I think one of the things that to your point is that what can get lost is that in order to be successful, it's not just that there's work that needs to be done. So whether you do it alone or with your friends, there's work that needs to be. You do have to show up every day. You have to go to school. You have to show up. You have to be there. You have to be persistent, and that's how you get to be successful. The recovery piece aside, and I think those are the things that, as much as we had that common friendship that made life, you know, a little bit fuller, actually our career paths were pretty much all individual. I mean, Robbie ended up being, you know, Worcester Public Schools, you know, kind of administrator. One of the guys, Joey, became a champion pigeon racer. Go figure, who would think about birds? You know, we used to all think he was crazy. But in different instances, we were all successful in our own right, which is really the only thing that matters. And most of that was really the development of relationships and family. Interestingly enough, Jim, Hank, and myself all had just one child, a girl. And Michael, another one of them, same thing. And whether it was coincidence or whatever, I don't really think there was anything more to it than that. But that's one of the.
But it's interesting.
One of the interesting pieces of our life story. And Hank, just tell you a little bit about Hank and his daughter Ayla. Hank, well, you read the book, so you know about Ayla, who was the miracle little girl who was born when Eileen had cancer. And back then, it truly was a miracle. She was the first baby ever to be conceived while the mother was undergoing breast cancer treatment. So it was pretty miraculous, that one there. So the feelings from which alcohol and drugs provide relief. The easy answer is everything. Whatever you're feeling, there's relief.
Only if you use enough.
Right. I guess, you know, to talk about a little bit in the very beginning is the first and most important thing is that it works. It does what you want it to do. My own little history is, and if you read the book, you know this, but as a young kid in Catholic school, I developed this fear of being able to talk in front of other people because of what happened with the nuns and all of that other stuff. And not probably the first time I drank, but one of the first times I drank, I was able to kind of speak, and all that fear went away. And so I fell in love. And that was it for me. So it doesn't require this, but for me, that was traumatic. For me, my whole class, all those friends laughing at me, fractured my whole psyche because my parents always told me I was the smartest kid in the world. And no longer was that happening. And so it's sometimes this little thing that most people would say, oh, Jack, get over it. But to me, wow, I was shattered. And it was the alcohol that relieved that. And then, obviously, I found bigger and better things along the way. But that's, you know, and again, for all of us, it can be different or the same.
You know, when you were saying that, I just had these flashbacks of trying to put the pieces together, which I've been doing for 30-odd years. But, you know, remembering sort of that moment that you just described of relief, I think is probably the best word that comes to mind. You know, without getting into a long, if you read the book, you know, my sort of life story, I guess, and my family history and all of that. But I was pretty lost kid and pretty angry and scared and didn't know up from down. And one day, somewhere I had learned that there was this cough syrup in my mother's medicine cabinet that had some magic stuff in it that could do something. And I drank about a half a bottle of that. And it felt like the feeling I describe is like someone dumped a bucket of warm honey on my head, and I could feel it just taking away all my fear, all of my worry, all of the pain, all of the insecurity, all of the everything that I had struggled with for as long as I can remember. It's like, oh boy, this is it. I'm in love. I'm in love. And because it gave me that relief I needed. And then it was, a 20-year journey trying to recapture that relief on a daily basis, because when you take it away, I didn't like what was left behind. And so it was very functional for me. And then I became dependent and then couldn't function without it. You can't function with it, you can't function without it, you end up a mess. I was a mess. Bona fide mess. But that's, when you said it works, it does. That's what triggered it for me, is I had that flash to that moment of, that aha moment. This is all I need in life, is a big thing of terpene hydrate, codeine. That's all I need, and I am golden. And that sort of opens the path. And it's very, what's the word, deceiving, I guess, is it provides that relief, that comfort, that warmth, that whatever you're looking for, and then at the same time, it starts to take away your self-worth, your dignity, your self-respect, any of those things that might be intact. I'm not sure if I had those intact when I started out, to be honest with you, but it takes those things away. And then you need more and more to fill whatever emptiness or void. So yeah, that's sort of my story in a stolen moment, I guess.
So part of the peer bonding, the rituals and rites of passage were really commonplace back then. And so, again, those would be some opportunities to kind of change, and we're beginning to address it. But still in this day and age, what's the most celebratory things is, drinking at a ball game. It's still the Animal House frat parties and all of that stuff. Now, that's somewhat changing, but if you've read the news over the past, I don't know, however many years, now that it gets reported openly how many alcohol deaths because of frat parties and all of this stuff. So before, when that was happening, that never made the papers. So back when we were kids, we lost our first friend. I believe he was 19 years old. And this is another one of the reasons we wrote the book, is to kind of chronicle a history that isn't just recent. It's been long going. So our friend that died at 19, his death certificate said he died of pneumonia, because no one talked about it back then. And no doc was going to put addiction, because he died with a needle in his arm. No doc was going to say he died from an overdose, because the parents actually, they were one of the more affluent families in Shrewsbury Street. The parents owned the market, so they could have that put on the death certificate. No one ever talked about that. Back then, more people died in our neighborhood from overdoses that came back in body bags from the Vietnam War. So it's been happening for a long time. It just was never talked about. Back then, the only things that were talked about, and yet they were considered to be unimportant, is many of the minorities would die, minority celebrities, black musicians and stuff. They were dropping dead left and right. Never was a problem. And again, it's been over time, and don't get me wrong, it is in proportions now that unfortunately is newsworthy. But this stuff has been going on for a long time, and because we really have a reticence to discuss this anyways openly, and because of all the shame and stigma that surrounds it, it's only just now becoming what we all consider to be a public health crisis. But the real public health crisis probably should be the prevalence of trauma in our world. But are we ready to address that? Probably not either. I know you're making some gestures. What are some of your thoughts on any of that stuff and reading the book and knowing the history has been going on for a long time? I mean, back then, how many remember the movie The French Connection? So back then, people were dying, every other day because of the pure heroin, or what many people say was fentanyl back then, that came into New York City and happened then because it was purity. I mean, and for those that, recognize how it really happens, I mean, you have a person probably in a basement with their mother's strainer pouring some cot and some pure stuff into the strainer and mixing it up, and that's what you get. So if you're the unlucky person, you get something that's 80%. No, well, actually, if you want something that's good and you're the unlucky person, you get something that's 1% and you won't get high. But if you're the lucky but yet unlucky person, you'll get something that's 80 or 90%, and when you do it, you'll OD. But the craziness is that if you put up a sign, really good deadly heroin over here and really bad heroin over there, you'd have a line out the really good deadly heroin door. And that's part of the insanity of it, because you don't chase something that's not going to work for you.
That person that you just talked about, and I really hadn't thought about this or made the connection until you just said it, is this friend of ours who died from an overdose at 19. His name was Anthony. And before he died, we were in my mother's kitchen. She was away. She was out of the country, and we were using some drugs. And he was the first one to go. And once he injected the heroin that we had bought, he went down. Now, another friend of ours who's subsequently dead too, we used to call him Stevie the Sailor. He's in that book. Stevie the Sailor and myself grabbed Anthony, threw him in my car, drove him to Memorial Hospital on Belmont Street, to the ER. One of us helped take him out of the car. One went in to get the doctors to come out with the gurney. As soon as they got him back in the car, where do you think we went?
Back to your kitchen.
You're damn right. Almost killed him. We left him for dead over at Memorial Hospital, and we went back to the kitchen and just said, well, we won't shoot as much as he did. Now that's insanity. For some reason, I had never made that connection until then. And then Anthony ultimately overdosed and is dead, and so is Stevie. And I'm sitting here, so go figure. I don't know why. Makes no sense. Makes no sense. Because it was the same drug. Cut by the same people, bagged and sold by the same person.
And I think, again, about peer bonding, rituals, and rites of passage, knowingly or unknowingly, we celebrate it. So that's the introduction at a very early age. This is what you should be doing. That's still what we see on TV. Now that the drug companies can advertise, that's all you see is take this and it'll cure whatever ails you. It's always about an immediate gratification, and it goes back to the chief cause of unhappiness is trading what you want most for what you want now. And that's what we're selling. We're selling, do this and you're going to feel better, but the reality is you don't. It's no different than the drugs that we did. Do this, you're going to feel better, but the reality is that you don't. And I think, somehow we need to get out of this kind of downward spiral that we're in. And again, it takes a village, and we do really need to look at things somewhat differently. Oh, I guess we move forward.
Did we move forward or backwards?
Did we move forward?
That was on our street. That was a local hangout on our street. Back in the 50s, you can see the cars. And my dad owned a bookmaking operation right across the street on this side of the street. And so that's where, that was like where the nightlife was on Shrewsbury Street, was Speedy's Hamburgers. It was like in Happy Days or whatever what movie was. Remember that?
Yeah,
No,
it was Happy Days, yeah.
Yeah, but wasn't that based on a movie, American Graffiti or something?
Yes,
That
yes,
was,
yes.
sort of the spot at the time. Everything happened at Speedy's. And there was a park right to the left of it, which is in the book, East Park. It's actually called the name of it is Christopher Colombo Park, but we called it East Park, and that's where a lot of our antics took place as well. And that's pretty prevalent or prominent in the book.
So you guys do this work. What do you think some of the things that people, various forms of denial?
What did you say?
Denial is not a river in Egypt, right? Isn't that one of the favorite lines?
What are we denying? Denying we have a problem? What else? Everything. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. Denial and blame. Yeah.
So minimizing, rationalizing, and self-deception. So there's a phrase that we have in 12-step about denial, and it's don't even know I am lying.
About everything. I keep coming back to that because I thought it was really profound, because I don't know what was said in something that you had mentioned, Jack, that made me think. I think when it's talked about the quick fix or the easy solution or whatever, because it works and it makes you feel good, as a society, that's what it was, as you said, as a society, what we're selling is, this feel good, that this will take care of all of your problems or fix, and make you feel good. And immediately my head goes to, why don't we feel good? And we deny ourselves that. And we deny that that's a problem. And so it gets more and more complex the more you dig down and drill into it. And I wish I had an answer. I'd write another book, but I don't. But I know, or I think I know, that we do deny it. And we don't know why we don't feel good. And so we look for some external artificial substance to make us feel good. And again, when I work directly with clients, I try to get around to that in an inadvertent way is, what is it that doesn't feel so good, that you need that to make you feel good? Let's start there, or let's take a look there, shine the light there. Because I think there's something there that takes you to, the pipe or the cooker or the bottle or wherever you go, is we have to figure that out. But if we can't talk about it because of denial, or we can't talk about it because of whatever, shame or stigma or whatever, then we're not going to get there.
Our society sells immediate gratification all the time.
Yeah. Gratification from what? That's my question is, why are we in so much distress? And I think it comes back to your point, and you maybe didn't make it intentionally in this way, but I think we live in a society, we're surrounded by war, trauma.
That's not a clinical term.
Yes, it is. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. We're on TV. I promised myself I would be careful. Can you edit that out, Charlie? Yeah, we're surrounded by something that doesn't make us feel good. Like you mentioned, Mate being born in Budapest when the Nazis had occupied, and everybody was doing this. And so in utero, this child and all of the Jewish babies that he alludes to or refers to were stressed and crying when they were born. That wasn't coincidental. It was the sort of sociological or environmental stuff that was going on during that time, that the nervous system was already compromised when these kids were born. And so something had to help them quiet that nervous system down. And they hadn't found turpin hydrate yet like I did. But it's the same principle.
How many of you have ever read The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk? So The Body Keeps the Score is really, it's about trauma. It's about trauma work. But what we are finding out now, more than anything else through the advances in neuroscience, is that our emotions live not necessarily up here, but they live in our body. Because what gets laid down in terms of memory is not just the memory, but the bodily sensation of the event. And so when you kind of experience trauma, either it's adrenaline, cortisol, comes rushing through your body remembers the entire sensation. And so the work now needs to go beyond just what happens up here, but actually what happens in the body. Because they're now measuring the physical kind of changes in bodily function when someone has a flashback, something like that. So we are learning more and more, but as I think it was either Vanderkolk or Daniel Siegel said, that what we know about the brain is like trying to learn about a football game with a stethoscope outside the Houston Astrodome. It's very little. And the brain has, I believe, more neural connections than there are particles in the universe. That's how complex it is. And we're just starting to get an understanding. So I don't know if that's good news, I don't know if that's bad news. We still have a long way to go to be able to understand kind of what makes us tick. I'm going to get way off the subject, but is anyone a fan of quantum physics? And so you know that at any given time, something can be happening. And that actually our thoughts and our ideas and feelings can actually change what's going on. Now, not everybody has to believe that, but that's some of the latest stuff that is going out there. Thank you for allowing me to talk about my science background. And yet I can't find my way to the library. Go figure.
No, you did great. You got here. I'm noticing the clock, and I don't want to sort of rush through anything, but we're nearing that 8:30 point. We have like 15 minutes left.
Oh, okay.
Are there things in there that you wanted to ask us about? We can keep rambling on about this stuff, and this is why we have this. But if there's something that you folks have.
We're now getting to the slide you wanted to talk about, John.
Which one?
While we wrote the book.
Oh, yeah, that one. Yeah. Well, we started to chit chat. Well, I was tap dancing before you got here, and so I was pulling all kinds of stuff out, and there were only a few people here. But you know, again, so now you get the formal version of why we wrote the book. You know, like I said, we were in recovery, doing this work for a long, long time. You know, a lot of what we were doing was our own work. And working in the treatment field, and I had the pleasure of working with Jack in opening a treatment facility up in Ashby, Mass, a residential treatment facility. So we were doing a lot, but before that, I had a private practice, and I would get a lot of calls from predominantly mothers that were crying and distraught and saying, you know, I don't know what to do. My son, my daughter are out of control. I'm scared. You know, they're heading off the cliff, and I don't know how to stop it. And I remember that one call was really heart-wrenching, and I either ran into Jack or called him, and I said, we have to do something. You know, we had been doing the work that we have been doing for probably 25 or more years at that point. And I said, you know, we know something from our experience. We know something about the work that we've done. We can't just sit on that. We need to share that and try to help some people. And so we started with the idea. And then, you know, again, the other part of it was my wife, who I've been married to since probably 30 years we've been together. She would often be around us and our crew. And every time she would come away thinking, oh, my God, you know, I can't believe some of those things that you guys talk about. You have to do something with that. You know, you should probably write a book. And I said, yeah. I really didn't have any interest in writing a book. And then that last call, when I either called Jack or I saw him, we see each other at the gym a lot, And I just said, we probably should really think about doing something. And that was really how it started. And then we tried to so Jack and I started to frame, a book about what? What will we write about? And that's when we came up with the idea of using our stories to tell the biggest story that there is hope, regardless of how bad you are. People do recover from this sickness. You can do it. We've done it. And so we'll use our stories to try to, just tell that story. And then so we wouldn't be complete without Hank, and I'll let you tell that part.
Well, so as it says, if Hank was here, he would say, I never wanted to write that book. I'm not going to say it like Jimmy
You don't
would
have
say
to
it.
edit that one,
But,
Charlie.
and it really was, because Hank was not a treatment guy. He's a 12-step guy. Looked at things quite differently. Was really, if you hear like hardcore 12-stepper and just believed that his way was the only way. Yeah. But beyond Hank, what we really started to do was ask all the guys that were in the book to write some of their story. Now, that became near impossible because, again, to go back, it really takes consistent effort to write anything. You have to write every day whether you want to or not. You have to put the words down whether you want to or not. And because Jim and I worked in the treatment field, it was somewhat easier for us to not only to just write, but to self-divulge, to know that in the end we were going to tell our story. And when we were almost done, that was a little bit of, oh, let's put on the brakes here. We might not want to self-divulge so quickly.
Yeah.
And so there was a lot that went into it. But for Jim and I, who openly, were recovery advocates and do a lot of work, and so, kind of people knew our stories. And actually, the honest to God's truth is for me, most of the stuff that I did when I wasn't in recovery made the papers anyway, so my life wasn't really that much of a secret. And but it was all of that went into it, is to like, how are we going to write this book? How are we going to publish it? I'll let Jim talk about, my daughter. I have 4 grandkids that are older than his daughter, so it was a little bit different there, but it was just different being able to kind of put that on paper and say, whoa, okay. Most people would read it. That's why he had the slide there and say, nah, that's not you. You never did that. That can't be you. But
that was a hard part for me. That was probably the only real hard part for me. Like Jack said, I had been doing this a long time. And a lot of people knew my story. But at the time, my daughter's 19 now. At the time, she was, I don't know, probably 16. And, I remember calling you, or we were together, I don't know. And I said, I'm really having a hard time about, her knowing that part of my life. For 19 years, she had known me as, as I am. We had conversations about some of my history. She knew it wasn't great, but, finally we did it, and she ended up reading either parts of it or all of it. And I remember her saying, what I was so afraid of was her looking at me differently. And she went to my wife. She didn't say it to me. And she went to my wife one day. She said, so Dad was a heroin addict? And of course, my wife couldn't lie. And that was the biggest fear for me. It has all worked out the way you would hope. And it was not a really big problem. It was just for her a real eye-opener. Like, oh my God, that's my father. You know what I mean? This guy that I've known for 19 years in this role. And I can't reconcile with that who he used to be. And she knows Jack and she knew Hank. And once she started to put the pieces together, and then shortly thereafter, it became, I want to say okay, but I think, she understood it differently. And I think my wife helped her to see, that sort of transformation from, that was a part of his life and their lives, but look at what they do now, and so I don't think she's, thrilled about that part of my life, but it hasn't affected our relationship in a negative way. Actually, it may have even strengthened it because her friends now, talk to her about this stuff and she talks to me about it. So I think, again, it was risky, but the benefits, I think, outweigh the risk for us. And you know, so there weren't a lot of hard parts for me. You know, I'm happy we did it. I don't regret doing it at all. And the feedback that we've received has been really positive, that people have found it to be hopeful, helpful in their lives and in their relationships.
And I think, you know, and speaking from my point, I have 2 granddaughters that are in their 20s, and one of the things that's allowed me to be a part of is be a part of their life's questions. So when they come across situations that, you know, relate to that book, they call Papa, hey, what do you know, and that's something that when I was growing up, there was no adult to call for guidance. And I think that relates to the thing is, where's the difference, is that there are adults, and again, I firmly believe that adult guidance is really important in making a person's life ultimately be successful. You know, I don't think it's the best idea for kids to be teaching kids how to grow up. I think adults need to teach kids how to grow up. Yeah. That's always been the role. That's the role that evolution has given us. That's why we stay with our children. But sometimes in this fast-paced world, we kind of let the TV do the job, or let the computer do the job, or the iPad do the job, or something like that. And I think we need to kind of revisit how important adult relationships are and that stuff there.
Yeah. That's a great way to sum it up, though, is, you know, even if those people were there and are growing up to call, I don't think they knew what we knew. And they maybe hadn't experienced what we'd experienced. So whatever they might have offered, you know, might not have been quite as helpful, maybe, you know. So yeah, I think there's a reason we're here. I don't know what it is, other than I keep thinking that, you know, I used to, when I first got sober, they talk about, you know, God's will and all this, and I struggle with, I don't know what God's will is for me. You know, and I don't know if I ever really fully figured it out, but as close as I could get was, you know, based on my own self-will, I was doing a good job of killing myself. And so, you know, this God that I guess I believed in, you know, had a different plan for me and spared me, because 2 of those people I talked about earlier that are dead could have very easily been me. But it wasn't, and I'm here. And the only thing that makes sense to me that I survived all of that was so I could sort of share it and maybe help somebody along the way that's struggling with something similar. There's no other reason why I'm sitting here or we're sitting here that makes sense to me. You know, it wasn't luck. It wasn't, you know, anything like that. I think it is to do this piece of work that we do. Somebody the other day called it sacred work, and I thought, sacred work? That's a stretch. You know, I never related that doesn't fit. Although somebody said to me today, I was sitting at my desk in my office, and they were looking at the side. She said, you look like a priest with that thing on there. That's 2 references to sacred things in my life this week. I'm not sure what that all means. But yeah, I don't think it's coincidental that we're here, Jack and I, or you folks. There's a reason. I just don't know what it is.
So that 4th person there is Robbie, the school administrator. And actually there's some differences that we all have. So we're not like uniform in all our beliefs, but we share enough in common to always be there to support each other. And I think that's, you know, a really important thing. You know, I seen on TV today, I know we have 5 minutes left, so I'm not going to say what I seen on TV. I'm going to ask, is there anything that you want to ask about that we've left out? Because you better ask now or forever hold your peace. Yes.
So one book I read somewhat recently was Chasing the Screen.
Yes. Johan Hari, very good book.
Yeah, and you know, he kind of talks about how we just kind of need to keep people alive, you know, and have kind of some policies where, you know, we can keep people alive to see so they can make it through addiction. So I don't know if there's any, because person than like a therapy person right now. So I wonder if there's any, policies like, that we could advocate, in our state to, I'm thinking like the monitored injection sites. I mean, do you think that has value? The harm reduction kind of stuff that's happening, do you think that's valuable? Are you seeing any positive results from that?
Well, from reading the book, you'll know that many countries that experiment with decriminalization and harm reduction are showing success in just doing that. Now, the argument here is that we're so much bigger, and that's not likely to work. But we need to do some things differently, whatever that may be. And again, I just go and say it takes a village. So if our village is going to be keeping people alive, we need to somehow universally adapt that. How does that happen? My sense is the easiest one to get behind, that's the least controversial, is prevention. That's my sense. So if we can prevent that, we won't have to worry about keeping people alive, they'll be alive. Because keeping people alive is not easy either. So my feeling, just my individual feeling, is that the best that we can do, and it's just kind of why they have baby pictures, in commercials, because everybody can relate, and it just elicits compassion, love, a good feeling. If you can bring how important our youth are to the forefront, then you have a chance. I'm a big, so there's probably some DCF workers. I'm a little bit out of date, but it was $13.68 is what they used to pay for a foster child. That can't buy diapers. That's the investment that we put in underserved and underprivileged kids. That needs to change. Because we're not giving them a chance. We're just not giving them a chance. So you can pick up a flag and wave it anywhere. I think it really will be beneficial to really help our kids. But Jim?
I think education, and I think a lot of the stuff that Hari talks about in that book makes sense to me. Will it make sense here? I don't know. We have to get to a point where we can maybe experiment and try some of those things, but we can't get beyond our own arrogance or our own denial and our, I almost said ability, but that word doesn't fit, our tendency to blame the victim. We continue to do that, and until we really buy into this notion, and I think we do, we're probably of the same ilk, that this is a sickness or an illness. There are so many people out there that say that's a crazy notion. It's not an illness, this is a choice. You choose to put that stuff in your body. So until we can change that and the shame and stigma that accompany that, I think we're fighting, a losing battle, if you will. But we're still in it, and I hope we continue to be in it, because I think we can change things. Things have changed, in our perceptions, in the way that we look at people and blame them for their sickness. It hasn't changed a ton, but it is changing, or it has changed. And we have to continue to do that. And for me, being an educator, that's the way we do it, is education. So, but policies around getting into schools and doing that education are still a little tricky, a little parochial. So, is it that time? Oh, my Lord. The old clock on the wall says we're closing in on 8:30. So this is where you get to, you didn't do your quiz about the trip to the Bahamas or whatever, about the quote in the beginning.
Well, that's because they read the book.
Oh, yeah,
so
all right,
I usually
never
do
mind.
this but this is a good one. So for those of you that have read this and know what I'm saying, you're disqualified.
Yeah, watch him scale. Oh, I was gonna say,
No, open in the book.
Watch him scale back the prize.
So it used to be a trip to Greece. It used to be a trip to Greece. But this is truly unfair, because oftentimes we speak to an audience that didn't get this book as an assignment. So this is not as fair. But, just to know how long this has been going on and where we need to go, Indeed, I believe if we take habitual, I'm going to change the words a little bit, addicts as a class, their heads and their hearts will be in an advantageous comparison with those of any other class. There seems ever to have been a proneness in the brilliant and warm-blooded to fall into this vice. The demon of addiction ever seems to have delighted in sucking the blood of genius and of generosity. What one of us but can call to mind some dear relative more promising in youth than all his fellows, who has fallen a sacrifice to this disease. He ever seems to have gone forth like the Egyptian angel of death, commissioned to slay, if not the first, then the fairest born of every family. Who said that?
I'm not
Trip to
giving any
Greece,
clues.
if you didn't read it. Oh, so no one's going to Greece. Tremidi Islands in Italy. I just came back from there this past August. It's absolutely gorgeous. You want to go? The clearest water I've ever been in. Abraham Lincoln. So back then he suggested that we need to look at things differently, because back then it was all about berating and punishing the alcoholic. Just really quickly, back in 1830, every man, woman, and child in the United States drank approximately 4 gallons of pure alcohol. By 1885, that went down to 1 gallon because of the change in the country with the temperance movement and everything else. So the good news is you can make a difference. We just haven't figured out what they've done.
But thank you for being here. This is how we do it, I think, is having open discussion and dialogue, educating one another, educating those we come in contact with, to try to diminish some of that, stigma, shame, blaming, all of those things that I think underlie this. And this is how we do it. It's hard, but, this is it. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, so nice to be here with you.